Hello, hello. We meet again. Um, this is an odd chapter. I will have, a fair amount to say about the first half or so, but as the chapter ends, it becomes very meaty and lots of terminology, things you have to learn, um, things I really can't help you with very much. The book does an excellent job. So in the beginning, I'm going to, add things as I often do. I see I only have 3 links here, which is not a ton, but I will digress a bit at the beginning, and you do have to understand these 3 concepts: a klaxon, Pavlov's apparatus. The highlighted link should be under Pavlov, and chimograph. You will have to describe those potentially on the quiz. And speaking of quizzes, I was doing, kind and gentle grading, I believe. It's clear to me that some of you did not master uh, the types of learning, particularly differentiating between classical and operant conditioning in chapter 2. If you're weak on that, don't trust my grading to tell you that you mastered it. You really should go back and everybody should look at that again. If you're not fluent um, in the types of learning that were dealt with there, you're going to have trouble not only with chapter 3 but the rest of the book. So give it the old college try. Go back and look at those questions, those issues in chapter 2. You really have to be comfortable with the letters and the lines and what they mean. And now chapter 3, nuts and bolts of classical conditioning. Um, and I'll have stuff to add at the beginning. And at one time, when I was in grad school, this was viewed to be historical and not very relevant to what was important, operant conditioning. But now we know that the two coexist, particularly if you're doing operant, you're certainly doing classical at the same time. And it's important to know the nuts and bolts and theories behind classical conditioning. Lots of terms in this chapter that you will have to come to grips with. Good news is it's an open book test, so that should make life somewhat easier. So there's the history of Pavlov and Stefan Wolfsohn, who was working in the lab, and Pavlov took his stuff and ran with it. Remember, as I'm sure I've mentioned, Pavlov had already won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on digestion before he started all this classical conditioning stuff. And his lab was very big and active and heavily controlled by Pavlov. He was pretty obsessive. And salivation is the first step in is a first chemical step in digestion. So, as a Nobel Prize winning researcher on digestion, he was very interested in salivation, and he would do the biochemistry of it, for example, and he became disenfranchised with with what he was doing with other organs in the body, and he hoped that classical conditioning uh, would give him access to information that he really wanted to do research on, and he began trying to understand the brain by looking at classical conditioning. And now we get to translations. You probably don't think very much about Hillary Clinton and um, when she was Secretary of State, she met with her counterpart, the Russian counterpart, and there she is meeting with him. And things had been relatively rough between the U.S. and Russia prior to her becoming uh, Secretary of State. And when she met with him, she had her trusty staff as a joke and also as a symbol make a reset button. And the idea was sort of blank slate. We're going to start over again and try to do it right this time. And unbelievably, speaking of not having good translators, they did not accurately translate the word reset for that button. And that was part of the laughing. It was a bad translation. And we have that again right here. So there are terms you must know. The book tends to, well, it's right here. You can see the conflict in your author. He In psychology, we usually talk about conditioned uh, stimuli and conditioned responses, and unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses. Apparently, that was a bad translation of the Russian, and it does convey useful information, I must admit. But a more accurate translation of the C in these abbreviations is not unconditioned, but unconditional, which the book prefers, but it slips once in a while. So when you see the C's and the book drops the C's, um, if many books don't say US, they say UCS. They don't say UR, they say UCR. When in the back of your head, hear the C that's not spelled out there, I want you to think about three words. One is unconditional. And if you love someone unconditionally, can they do something to make you not love you anymore? And if they're using the term unconditional uh, accurately, they can survive anything. They love you unconditionally. There was a famous movie where the heroine said, when her lover apologized, she said, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." And that means it's unconditional. So I want you to see the C's in these letters and think unconditional, without qualification, no learning required. And by the way, that's a concept some of you folks had trouble with when you were dealing with the classical conditioning question from the last quiz. Uh, you don't you don't dogs don't go to drool school. You don't go to school and the teacher tells you, well, today we're going to teach you to blink your eye when I jam a pencil in it. Those behaviors are what I call free with the genes. They just happen. They happen unconditionally. They are unconditioned. Now, this course used to be called conditioning and learning, and those are synonyms. Conditioning refers to learning. So I want you to think of the term unconditional. I want you to think of the term unconditioned, which is the original or not I want you to think of conditioned, conditional, and learned. So if the C means learned, you could have the unlearned stimulus. And again, you don't have to go to school to learn to blink your eye if someone jams a pencil in it. You do it automatically, and the behaviors don't have to be trained. Uh, so they are unlearned responses. They are unconditional responses. They don't depend on prior learning to acquire the skill. And so the three terms again are unconditional, or no, geez, conditional, conditioned, which is a synonym for learned, learning, and learned. I want you to know those three terms and be able to discuss, or, list those three terms. Um, conditional, conditioned, which is a synonym for learning, and learned. So the book pretty consistently only uses two letters, and it says US. But what it means is unconditional stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unlearned stimulus. You didn't have to learn what it meant. And the unconditioned response is uh, unconditional, unconditioned, and unlearned. You don't have to train. And again, some of you were weak on that in the last quiz, and you can't be weak anymore. You have to master uh, these concepts. Of course, for Pavlov, we think of bells. He used a lot of stimuli, and he was a digestive physiologist. So his unconditional stimulus was a puff of meat powder. And when you get a puff of meat powder in your mouth, you salivate, which is the unconditional response. And Pavlov and his team were excellent surgeons. So they learned to excise, externalize a salivary gland. So when the salivary gland produced saliva, it didn't go into the mouth, it went into Pavlov's technology, as we'll see. And this technology you have to be able to describe. Okay, so there's in English on the left, bell, salivate, food, salivate, and the classical way of defining classical conditioning is bell meat powder. But that's CS, and the CS is a conditional stimulus. It's not conditional whether you hear the bell, you just hear the bell, but its meaning is based on training. So it's conditional, it's conditioned, which means learned, and it's also the learned stimulus. So the CS, depending on how you view this learning system, um, can trigger the learned response, the CR. It is paired with the unconditional stimulus, which unconditionally triggers the unconditioned response. So in the end, the bell can trigger salivation, and the dog salivates if you put meat powder in his mouth. Um, and the question in this chapter in the beginning is, well, what's being learned here? How is that being acquired? And by the way, Pavlov, being a Nobel Prize winning digestive physiologist, he did biochemical analyses of saliva that was unconditioned and saliva that was conditioned. And they're not quite the same, which I don't think the book talks about. So, the book sort of talks about what I just talked about. And he used lots of cues, metronomes, bells, lots of things. And generalization, where you can be trained with a certain, for example, type of bell, but we can get another bell that sounds similar, but it's a little bit different. And if it's close to the original bell, the animal may respond pretty much identically, but if it's quite different, response will be diminished. And there'll be a lot of discussion of generalization later in the chapter. And there are all the letters strung together. Unconditional stimulus, unconditional response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. And here we go. This chapter, you can tell this guy does research on classical conditioning. He loves it, and these people are very anal about how they do their research. They use a lot of controls. They think a lot, and he's going to force you to do the same thing. So there's SR learning, stimulus response learning, but stimulus substitution theory, SS. Uh, the Pavlov was a fan of that. Ringing the bell became a substitute uh, for the food in controlling the drooling response, known as stimulus substitution. Research has followed suggesting the association is most often SS. Although, as is often the case, because this is the real life, as I like to say, this isn't philosophy, this is science. It can go either way, but most often it's SS. So there's a diagram depicting the theoretical underpinnings of SR learning, where the bell for SR, the stimulus, the learned stimulus, learns to be associated with the unconditional response. It triggers the unconditional response. In SS learning, the theory is that the bell uh, learns to be associated with the unconditional stimulus, which of course unconditionally generates salivation. And oh, good, my first link, and here it is. Um, they're talking about a klaxon. Now, I used to watch a lot of World War II Navy movies because my dad was in the Navy. And you've probably heard of klaxon, but it doesn't really describe it. So I've given you a link, and you can play the klaxon to your heart's content. So it kind of looks like a speaker, and it does speak, but it's not like modern speakers. It's a mechanical device. Let's do that one more time. And boy, this takes me back to submarine movies. You know, they play the klaxon and they scream, dive, dive, dive. It's hard to ignore a klaxon. Klaxons were also used on surface ships. They're very mechanically reliable. They're very loud. I suspect we don't use them anymore, but at one time they were popular. So if a klaxon plays near you, as it says, it's a very loud stimulus that arouses fear. Early in my research, my doctoral dissertation, I studied responses in rats to loud noises, not klaxons, but I had an electronic way of generating loud noises. I also used clipboards, and I would get behind the rat and clip the clipboard, and boy, that was loud. And I was studying the neural circuitry, the acoustic stall reflex, and that was fun. And so, even with the stimulus as strong as the klaxon, if you do it over and over and nothing bad happens to you other than, oh my God, there's the klaxon again, you chill out. So, unfortunately, this diagram, and oh boy, you're going to see Rescorla a ton for the rest of this course. Um, Unfortunately, suppression ratio hasn't been clearly defined yet in the book, and here they are using it in a figure. Notice the y-axis at the bottom is 0, which is an uncommon, and it goes up 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. If there is no fear response, this is a condition suppression study. Um, you'll have a suppression ratio of 0.5. So 0.5 means nothing happened. So even after, and let's look at this, the way they have the design described. This is done a lot. Notice you have group 1 and group 2, which unfortunately are not color coded. And down below you have group 1 and group 2, and group 1 is red and group 2 is blue. So L in this context is a light associated with klaxon, and both groups 1 and 2 have an initial training phase where you do a certain number of, it's in here. The numbers are, the actual numbers of trials is not very important. It's the concept that's important. So they are trained to associate the light with the klaxon, and if they're fearful, they will have a higher suppression ratio, closer to 0.5. So group 1, light klaxon, and then there's phase 2. And in phase 2, they just go nuts with klaxon, 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 but nothing happens, just the klaxon. So they should be habituating to that. Now, group 2 gets the same phase 1 training, but in phase 2, they just get to chill. They don't have any additional stimulus pairings. And then you have the test. So you're testing with L, which is the light, and the question means, ooh, think about it, what should happen? And group 1, which has had a chance to habituate to the klaxon, they are less fearful. The red bar is taller than the blue bar. And group 2, which didn't get to habituate, they are more suppressed. They're almost completely suppressed. And it's a cute little study. And that's Rescorla. There's going to be a ton of Rescorla in this book. And there's habituation. And okay, I marked this researcher named Holland. We may have seen him earlier, but one of your peers graduated from the university, and she did a summer. While she was still an undergraduate, she did a summer research experience with Holland, and he was really impressed. And she ended up later getting a really good into a really good dissertation doctoral program. And I wanted to think it was me who wrote a good letter who got her in, but I'm sure it was Holland. He is a mover and shaker, and he does stuff now that's pretty close to neuroscience. Um, Neuroscience and learning go together pretty well. So, and notice the Holland's 2008 for a good review. Yeah, that's Holland. Um, then there's this concept of second order or higher order conditioning. Uh, yeah, you find a $10 bill on the ground and you're pretty excited. But that piece of paper really doesn't have much intrinsic value. It has value because of association learning. It's it's a CS that you had to learn had value. And there's a cute little story, I think, later in the chapter about Canadian money versus U.S. money, and they use colors and we do not. And a stimulus that's very salient is another term that's going to be important for the rest of your life in this course. Very salient, that is relevant to Canadians means nothing to us. So we handle their money and we don't care about the color because we've learned to value money based on numbers. So here's phase 1, light is associated with food. And then in phase 2, a tone is associated with the light. So lights don't have any intrinsic meaning. You have to learn that they mean something, but you just learned they meant something in phase 1. and then we test you on the tone. So the tone has been associated with the light has been associated with food, and if in the test you respond to the tone, that's second order conditioning. And this is sensory preconditioning, where you associate tone and light, which doesn't really mean much, but you associate them. And then you associate light with food, so the light acquires meaning. And then you test on tone, which has never been associated with food. And you can get sensory preconditioning. So, you should be able to describe these designs. Of course, you'll have an open book, so that will make life much easier. And there's a discussion of that. Um, okay, I have to digress now, and we are going to go back to the good old days of Pavlov and his technology before we go into the rest of the chapter, which is modern stuff. So we're going to go back to and here's Pavlov's apparatus. I may ask you to describe this apparatus. So there's a dog. It's a pretty big dog. Um, it looks like it's restrained. Um, it's really, those slings and things are basically reminders. The dog is extremely well trained, and it's not a physical restraint. They just, if the dog starts moving too far out of position, they'll tug a bit, and the dog will go back in position. So here we have an excised salivary, externalized salivary gland, and the saliva from that gland goes into this tube and goes down and down and down and then over. And now something interesting happens. There's a paddle here, and it's a big paddle. So when a drop of saliva hits the paddle, you can't miss it. We'll talk about that in a second. But the paddle is sloped so that the saliva uh, rolls down the paddle and into this graduated cylinder. So at the end of the study, you can measure the saliva in that cylinder. And believe it or not, Pavlov used to sell dog drool to the locals as something to promote health, which reminds me of some things that people take even today to promote their health that have relatively little value. But now let's follow the paddle. So the paddle is on a wand. This means that's a little joint, and this is a little joint, and this is a permanent, like a ring stand. It doesn't move, but this joint allows this whole rod to move when a drop of saliva hits the paddle. And by the way, this apparatus looks like this because we didn't have modern technology when Pavlov was doing this. There's no electricity in this design. Everything is based on tubes and air and not electricity. Nowadays, of course, we have electricity and you don't need all this, but oh, geez, did you have to get this right if it was going to work? And Pavlov was a taskmaster. Okay, so when a drop of saliva hits this paddle, this whole wand is going to move, and the wand is connected to this rectangle here. But it's not a rectangle. It's like an accordion. It's rubber. It can compress. It's sealed, and out the bottom, it's connected to a tube. So when a drop of saliva hits here, the air in this black accordion thing is compressed, which compresses air through this entire tube over here. Then it comes to another fitting, and that fitting is connected to another accordion thing. And if the air is compressed, this will blow up a little bit. And if it blows up a little bit, its arm will go to this articulated needle thing here, and you'll get tracings on that device on the right. Now, in this diagram, which is why I almost didn't use it, the tracings look like ink. They weren't, because if you were to put ink, an ink supply over here, and a tube filled with ink out to this recording device, it would add so much mass that it wouldn't work. So it had to be able to write without ink. And these recordings were not black on white; they were white on black, as we'll see in a second. One of my wife's fathers was a physician, and he had to deal with this kind of device, which was run this way in physiology labs in med school. And he said they used to kill most of the lab dealing with this device. It was very demanding. So let's review this one more time. The dog is well trained, gently restrained. It will not, if it really wanted to get out of there, it would, although the collar would probably hold it. It has a salivary gland that has been moved to the outside of the face. The saliva goes into this tube and drops down on this paddle. And from that paddle, it can go into this graduated cylinder where it can be measured and biochemically analyzed and sold to the neighbors. But as it hits the paddle, it shakes this whole device here, which drives this rod into this accordion thing, which increases air pressure. And that increased air pressure goes into this tube and goes up into that accordion thing, which expands it a little bit, which goes up onto this stylus, and it moves it over on the right side. Quite a setup. Nicely done, Pavlov. Nice going on your Nobel Prize. Okay, now I'm going to show you what that device on the right really was. It's a kymograph. And this is what my ex-father-in-law spent most of his time dealing with in physiology labs. This might remind you of what we record earthquakes with, and it's related. But over here we have a ring stand and what looks like a diaphragm, although I fear that this is electricity. And you have a stylus, which rests up against paper over here, and the paper is black. And there's a clock motor. You wind it up and you set it for a certain speed. And the clock motor drives this cylinder. So if nothing is happening, you get a straight line. And if something like a drop of saliva is hitting your device, you get a spike. Why is this black? Well, if you ever dealt with a kerosene lamp, if you get it adjusted correctly, you don't generate much soot. But if your lamp is badly adjusted, you get lots of soot. And if you've dealt with soot, you learn very quickly that it transfers to everything. So what you would do at the beginning of the lab is you would grab a piece of paper, fire up a kerosene lamp, and adjust it badly. So it generated a lot of smoke, a lot of soot. And you held that piece of paper over your sooty lamp until it was all black. And then you carefully took it over to the kymograph, this big cylinder, and you clipped it there. And now you have a homogeneously black piece of paper on a cylinder that rotates at a known speed. And then you bring your stylus up and it touches the paper. It doesn't have ink in it, but where it touches, it scratches off the soot. So it's this was cutting edge technology at one time, and some very famous science has been done with this. At the end of your recording session, you're of course stuck with this piece of paper with soot on it, and if you touch it, you're going to get fingerprints on there, and if you brush up against it, you can wipe off your tracings or the soot around your tracings. So you had to take it to the lacquer table, and you would put it on the lacquer table and take a paintbrush, a lacquer brush, and get lacquer and paint carefully over the soot a coat of lacquer. And then you would hang it up to dry. And the next day you would come in and you'd have a piece of paper with dried lacquer that you could touch safely. And we have chymograph recordings from, you know, well over 100 years ago. As long as the paper survives, they will survive. The soot won't go away, and the lacquer tends to hang in there. So when we get to operant conditioning, I'm going to be pushing technology too. And by the way, this device is relevant to how we record behavior. At least we used to in operant conditioning, but by the time Skinner came along, we had electricity, so no chymographs. Okay. So, and you need to be able to describe all of those for the quiz. Those are testable. And now we're getting into a lot of things that are extremely well described. And now we're talking about things that can be confused with classical conditioning, and there's sensory preconditioning. And Holland shows up here again. And you need to be able to describe how to do that. It mentions figure 3-4. We'll get to that. How we study classical conditioning, we don't do saliva anymore. Pavlov was too clever. Normal people can't do what he did, but we can do some things. So we have conditioning preparations, and we've already alluded to one of them. There's one that's a little hard to look at. So the bunny is restrained, and you can puff air onto its eye, and you can elicit an eye blink, an unconditioned response. And it points out those are 20 trial blocks, which isn't overly important, but it indicates that you have to do a lot of trials here before you get very good conditioning. So 80% response, where you get an eye blink to the conditional stimulus that you didn't get before. But look how many blocks: 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, like 140 trials before you get very robust conditioning. The person who wrote my neuroscience textbook back in the day, he studied this, and he was able to map how conditional and unconditional stimuli were relayed through the brain. He did very clever research. This book is not about neuroscience, so that's not discussed here. But eye blink is still done. There was a researcher at Wilkes or King's, I can never remember which is which. There are ways to do this in people, where you sit with your head in a bit of a restraint, and they puff air at you, and they have photo detectors that can watch you blink. So this I don't think it's done a ton in rabbits anymore, but it is done in people. Okay, now fear conditioning in rats is important to me. I used to do this. And I'm pretty sure we've already seen Watson and Rayner and little Albert and training little Albert to be afraid of the white rats and bunnies and things. Pretty sure I showed you that. Ledoux is important to me. He has written a very nice book for the masses, and he has a musical group, and he performs in New York City, and it's called the Amygdaloids. And again, this is not a neuroscience course. I've always wanted someone to work in his lab, and here's Fearing, which is all of his stuff is kind of creepy. And this looks a lot like areas not far from here. Nice boots. Yeah, a little creepy. Um, he performs in bars in New York City, and he's brilliant, and has written a very approachable book on fear and fear conditioning, if that interests you. I have one or two amygdaloid albums downloaded somewhere. And here's conditioned suppression, also known as the conditional emotional response, CER technique. Now, it would have been nicer if this had been done earlier in the chapter, but there's the basic design. There's a rat in Skinner box, and notice the grids. They're stainless steel. They go straight across, and the animal stands on usually more than one grid. So if you electrify those grids, the animal will complete the circuit and get a shock. My bird feeder was being attacked by a bear, and I electrified my bird feeder, and everybody was freaked out that I was shocking birds. I was not shocking birds because the only way to get shocked was to complete the circuit. So if you had like an ostrich who was standing on Earth and was pecking at the bird feeder, or if I did that, I would get shocked. And if the bear did it, it would get shocked. But you see birds sitting on high power lines all the time. It's only half the circuit. They don't get shocked. There's the rat pressing a lever to get food. And we'll go into this in more detail later. This is more modern. It's all electrical. That's like a bubblegum machine back there, but it has food pellets. And there's a light here that usually indicates something is up. And what's being indicated here is you hit the lever now, you're going to get shocked. You're not just going to get pellets, you're going to get shocked. So this is where the suppression ratio comes in. So as I said, if you're not being suppressed, the shock is not causing fear in you, and you merrily hit the lever like nothing's going on, even though the light indicates you're about to be shocked, you get a suppression ratio of 0.5. And you can see in the first trial block, which is 2, not that that's very important, but boy, this is a lot faster than bunnies and eye blinks. It's around 0.5, which means there's like no suppression. But after 2 trials, you get to the second set of 2 trial blocks, and the animal is down around 0.1, and then next block is like 0.8, and then 0.95, and then maybe 0.4, and then no responding at all. So this is a very, very popular way of studying classical conditioning. So it may be referred to as conditioned suppression or conditional emotional response. And the shock levels used in this modern modern research is not very high. Oh no, but it's enough to get the job done. and how to calculate a suppression ratio. Oh, look, Kim and Fanslow. Fanslow is the guy at UCLA that I wanted my student to work with after she worked with Holland, and she did. And Kim was his graduate student who did research that another one of my students did research on, and he eventually went to Yale and then I think the University of Washington. So there's some big names there. Fanslow is an exceptionally good scientist. Anybody who does cross conditioning, you have to be. So look at the calculation of the suppression ratio. So all the responses are being recorded. So you look at the how many responses occur during the CS being presented, which is usually that light, and then you take that number and divide it by the sum of what the animal was doing before you turn the fear stimulus on and that number. So if the animal doesn't know to be afraid, it is unaffected by the light stimulus. So if they're doing 10 responses in a time unit, they will do 10 before the stimulus is on. They will do 10 during the stimulus is on, which is 20. And then you divide 10 by 20 and you get 0.5. And that's the suppression ratio. So you have to be able to describe how that's calculated. And, Skinner from 1941. He used a lot of equipment that was, left over from World War II. And there's Ledoux, a lot of familiar names here in memory. And auto shaping, if you look back at chapter 2, I gave you some videos of what auto shaping looks like. And this is popular. And what's weird is we all thought pigeons pecking keys was operant, and it certainly can be. But as I told you, my peers were very happy when they discovered auto shaping, and you could just turn the light on and off, and the animal would start pecking the key for free, meaning they can go get a soda and not have to sit in the dark watching pigeons. So there's a pigeon. By the way, look at the pigeon is not standing on stainless steel rods like the rat. Pigeon feet are very difficult to shock. So if you want to shock the pigeon, that's not going to work. So there's the key where you can illuminate it to signal that the food is about to be delivered. Now, this looks a little bit more like eye blink conditioning, but my peers didn't care. So there's peck rates per second, and the animal starts pecking for free. And they'll even peck. Well, you don't have to peck. Now, when you're shaping them, often you do make the key actually work. But you can make it so the key never works. It just shows lights. Um, and so that's an elicited response. It's not operant conditioning. They can't resist. And there's a humorous story. A key can be placed at the end of a long box where food is at the other end of a box, and the light will go on and off, indicating the food is about to occur. And the animal's tendency to peck automatically is so strong, they will go far away from the food and peck and never get food. Things we do to pigeons. So that's a popular one. And here's a rat version of that with nose poking. Term goal tracking is used here. Conditioned food cup entry magazine approach. So the where the food comes out is called the food magazine. So the animal starts poking in there even though they don't have to. So that works. And with the photocell, it's easy to record. And here's John Garcia from the previous chapter. taste aversion learning, which at first nobody would accept was classical conditioning, and now here it is in chapter 3, uh, being an example of how to study classical conditioning. And I've already mentioned Damian. I used to use his book, but then he put the kissing elephant on the cover, and I don't like that. Yeah. So learning is involved in many things, like addiction and love, but it also can be play a role in people losing their appetite uh, when they get chemotherapy or radiation. And by the way, Garcia started by studying radiation because your federal government wanted to know what would happen to our troops when we were exchanging tactical uh, field artillery delivered atomic bombs to commies on the other side of that hill. They knew they would get sick, but they wanted to know how long and for what, whether they could get back to work. And one of the side effects of radiation is nausea. And this ice cream, uh, it's named later. I tried to look it up. I couldn't find it, the name of the ice cream. But there's, you know, painful to read, particularly since I'm about to be irradiated by a bunch. Uh, there's definitely classical conditioning involved in post chemo radiation treatment for things like cancer. What affects the strength of classical conditioning? And many of these will be important for operant conditioning as well. Be able to describe accurately, and man, I mean accurate, these types of conditioning. So the top one is delayed. The CS goes on, the little histogram bar goes up, and as soon as it goes off, the US is delivered. Notice there's no overlap. Uh, there's uh, there's a delay between the onset of the CS and the onset of the US, but the US is off, and then the delay, then the US occurs. Trace conditioning is quite different. The CS goes on, it goes off, and then nothing happens. And then you have your US. There's been interesting neuroscience research on this. This is harder, as you can imagine, and it involves different parts of the brain. Delayed conditioning works really good. Short trace conditioning works well too. Simultaneous conditioning, where the two stimuli go on and off together, you would think that that would work well, but it has no predicted value to speak of. Um, you're already being shocked or whatever bad is happening to you. So there's little reason to learn anything, and learning is an evolved mechanism. But you should be able to describe it. And then there's backward conditioning. Um, and here the US occurs before the CS. And, you know, if I were doing my normal lecture, I'd be talking about learning and evolution and what is going to help you survive more. That is a neutral stimulus, a CS predicts a biologically relevant stimulus, a US, or a biologically relevant stimulus predicts a neutral stimulus. And the former, which is delayed conditioning, works best. And my example there is which helps you survive more, horn truck or truck horn, uh, horn truck. And then there's timing, and there, you know, we go back to discussion of one kind of delay, and it, you know, discusses what I've already uh, dealt with. These are good discussions. This is a great book and a great chapter. Uh, it's just that I can add things to some stuff, but not all, and that will become deeper later in the chapter. Now, this is a very interesting figure. that has some important things to say. So the US here is not a blue rectangle, it's a blue dot. And on the top, you have mass trials where it could be CS, then shock, CS, then shock. It doesn't have to be shock. And then you have space trials where you have CS shock and then a pause, and CS shock and then a pause. And the third one looks like spaced, but it's really masked because the CS durations have become much longer. So if you look at the top one, you see the duration of the CS is as long as the duration of the CS-CS interval. And if you look down below, the CS duration is as long as the CS interval. So that looks as if it's spaced, I'm sorry, but it's really masked. And spaced training is better for learning. And by the way, if you're studying for things, spaced studying is better than cramming. I'll have a lecture on that later. Novelty. Um, the US is salient, significant no matter what. The CS um, is neutral, and how novel things are can affect um, how readily you'll associate a CS with the US. And there's latent inhibition and exposure to a CS where nothing happens a bunch of times can make it more difficult for you to learn that that CS is now uh, relevant, salient, latent inhibition. The US pre-exposure effect uh, is similar. Um, if you do the US a bunch, you don't learn as well to associate a CS with it, and nice discussion there of why that would be true. The intensity of the CS in US, nobody uses stimuli as strong as the klaxon. Um, within a limit, more is better, but it can become way too much if it goes too far. Um, it says down below, more intense CSs are not always better than weaker. I mean, if you can't hear the stimulus, you're not going to learn to associate things to it very effectively. But if the stimulus knocks you over, uh, it, it, it becomes on the edge of being an unconditional stimulus. And that's relevant here. You have pseudo conditioning, pseudo, and sensitization. These are things that people who do classical conditioning obsess over because they want to study classical conditioning. They don't want to study pseudo conditioning or sensitization. And when they first attacked Garcia and the poison avoidance stuff, they were charging that he was not dealing with real classical conditioning. He was dealing with these phenomena, which are real. And, good researchers have to deal with them, and you have to be able to describe them. Um, and pseudo conditioning, sensitization are possible with any conditioning experiment. So it's something you always. Oh, here's the name of the ice cream, Mapletoff. I went looking for that to give you a link to it. I couldn't find it. Apparently, not only isn't it good if it's associated with chemotherapy, it didn't sustain as an ice cream flavor on the free market. Uh, this is very clever research. Bernstein uh, did it, and where's the design? Well, it's described. Um, when do you and don't you get good conditioning to the ice cream flavor? And there's going to be a description later. It's described here. They didn't give you design feature. So basically, if you associate maple top with chemotherapy, people won't go back for it. But if you associate with uh, chemotherapy with a toy or something, and then say, "Well, would you like some maple top?" Whatever that is, the kids will pretty much happily take it because it hasn't been paired with anything toxic. Condition inhibition. um, so you need to be able to talk about excitation and inhibition, um, and the absence of a stimulus can be relevant. Uh, for example, in Scranton, when I was maybe in high school, the city of Scranton um, started putting unmarked police cars on the streets, and the locals went nuts. They wanted no part of that because there was no stimulus to tell them that they had to obey the law. And believe it or not, back then the city actually complied and put markings on the cars so that people could know when to do things that are illegal. Unbelievable. Um, so that's an important discussion. And there's how to produce conditioned inhibition. And here we've been talking about stimuli. They're usually simple letters, but X is a letter that's being chosen to help you realize that when X is there, the stimulus is not uh, present. And this is also the introduction of the concept of compound stimuli, where it's not, Bell me powder. It could be Bell might light me powder, a compound stimulus. And then you can study the two stimuli separately after having paired them to see if the animal has learned to associate the unconditional stimulus with both the bell and the light, or possibly only one. So there's a discussion of many ways to do this, and you should be able to do a little bit of statistics here. Um, you can have an explicitly unpaired procedure, and if things are explicitly unpaired, it's a bit like related to unconditional. They never occur together. If you see one, you don't see the other. But a more complex and possibly more realistic condition is a negative correlation, where they can occur together, but most often uh, they did not. And inhibition of delay is interesting. And there's Rescorla again. Oh, geez, what a guy. So you should be able to describe how to do that, and how can we detect conditioned inhibition. And these are theoretical data; they're not real. So the one exciter is your benchmark. That's what you're above or below. And you have a compound stimulus where one is an exciter and one is an inhibitor. Inhibitor uh, could be explicitly unpaired or negatively correlated. And then two exciters, uh, which can not literally summate, but can lead to more responding. I mean, this makes sense, but I realize there's a lot of terms. Uh, and exciters and inhibitors don't literally add to one another. Uh, it's just relative to each other. You can also study retardation of acquisition, where if you have an inhibitor or a facilitator present, you can, well, this is retardation. So if you have an inhibitor present, you can slow learning, slow the acquisition of learning to a former neutral stimulus. And these are theoretical data again. The red line is what would happen if you just did normal trading. Response strength goes up and then plateaus. But if there's an inhibitor present, uh, you get less learning. Um, Bidirectional response systems, you can go above or below the baseline. Uh, theoretically, with conditioned inhibition, you could go up above 0.5, but that tends to virtually never happen. Um, these are things that might look like inhibition, but aren't. And there's Rescorla again. And it's a nice discussion. They're not really inhibition. And you should be able to describe what they are. And if I asked you to list things that look like inhibition but aren't, uh, CS pre-exposure effect, yeah. And we're getting into the part of the chapter where I really can't add much. There's Boughton again, who's your author. Information value. And Rescorla is going to come up here quite a bit. Does often the CS give you new information? If it does, you'll probably learn about it. If it doesn't, you'll probably ignore it. And there we go. There's Rescorla. Rescorla 66, 67, 68. And there's what was sort of discussed before: positive contingency, zero contingency, which means it can occur together, but often it doesn't, zero correlation, and then negative correlation, where if the one happens, the other doesn't. And there's strength through conditioning, you have excitation, you have neutral, and you have inhibition. Tons and tons of Rescorla. And then, he walks you through Rescorla's designs, which are elegant. Pairings of CS and US were not sufficient to produce conditioning because the CS provided, or we think because the CS provided no new information. It wasn't salient. It didn't help the animal learn anything very useful. So there's the contingencies discussed from the other figure. And I have an unnatural attachment to the next guy, Kahneman. I remember learning about his research in graduate school. And the phenomenon in my day was called the Kahneman blocking effect. Now he's just referring to it as blocking and does mention Kahneman. But what the hey, give the guy his due and call it a Kahneman blocking effect. And now we get into a fairly complex design. And you have two groups, the red group and the blue group, group 1 and 2. And you have suppression ratio. And remember that a big number here approaches 0.5, and that means no suppression. And then a little number means lots of suppression. So in phase 1, you have 16 trials, noise with shock. So the animal learns that the noise precedes the shock. And then in phase 2, everybody gets 8 light noise shock pairings, compound stimuli. So group 1 could learn more about the shock. Group 2, this is their first exposure to shock. And then we're interested in the light. So we're interested whether in phase 2, the light, which was not in phase 1 for group 1, acquired any fear-producing potential. And you're doing the same thing in group 2, where the compound stimulus light noise was associated with shock. And you can see that having had 16 trials with noise, the animal seems to say, oh, I got this. Noise bad, I get shocked. And then you show them light noise, and they say, well, the light's not important. I've already learned about the noise. And then they test me on the light, and they say, who cares about lights? And there's no suppression. But group 2 animals have a compound light noise stimulus and shock, and they learn the relevance of both. So the Cayman blocking effect, I like the design. I don't know why I like the guy's name. I just do. So here's something where your cues are a little bit different than normal. Notice that shock is written either with the capital S and lowercase everything else, or it's written all in caps with 2 exclamation points. You really zap them. And you have 2 phases, and once again, in the test, you're looking at whether light has acquired fear. And again, you're dealing with suppression ratio. So group 1, virtually no suppression. Group 2 had learned noise and shock. Okay, I got that. But now we've got light noise, and geez, what was that? And that's novel. And the animal learns to fear the light in the third test group. And then in the third group, which is very clever, you have noise and intense shock, and then you have light noise and intense shock. And you basically don't learn about the light again because you already learned it in the first one. The phase 2 was not very novel. So that's nice science. Overshadowing, you should be able to describe. Pavlov did it way back in 27. It's a little bit like blocking, but it's not blocking. So take a look at that. And relative validity and conditioning. Wagner worked with Rescorla. We'll see a lot of, I think he died since the last time I taught this class. He was teaching at Yale. 2 of graduates at the university were his teaching assistants. He did really, really good work, just like Rescorla. Now you're going to have to sit down and, maybe grab a soda to look at this. So you have a correlated group and an uncorrelated group. And again, the correlated group is what has been group 1, it's red. And the uncorrelated is the second one. This is not condition suppression. This is graphing trials with a condition response. So with condition suppression, tall bars mean not much learning, but here tall bars mean learning. So in the correlated group, A is always associated with the US, and the BXs, B is not, X is in all those. And then in the uncorrelated group, it's a bit of a jumble. So you have AX with US, AX with no US, BX with US, BX with no UX, and you get much better training to X in the uncorrelated group. So that's nice research, a little complex. You have to sit down and look at that. This is real world. It relates to nausea again. Um, oh, I'm sorry. No, this is drug craving. So this is a bit like Siegel. So you have odor room, friend room, odor room, friend room, and drug, no drug. So, and user A and B have different experiences. Uh, and notice that A, odor and room are always associated with the drug. And in B, the odor and the friend are both associated with the drug. So, and the concept of relative validity is mentioned there. And that's cute research and certainly relevant. Again, if you're going to be dealing with addiction as a clinical psychologist, you really have to know this stuff. And we're out the other end. And there's Pavlov and second order conditioning, generalization, which we're going to talk about quite a bit more later. And there's the relatively modern ways of dealing with studying classical conditioning. The suppression ratio is a little confusing. Take a pen, write the formula down, plug in some numbers, and figure out how that works. Remember that more is less. Conditioning with conditioned emotional responses. Lots about controls and prediction and whether the CS tells us something we didn't know before. And then there's lots of terms: condition inhibition, explicit unpairing, negative correlation, inhibition of delay. I apologize that I can't help you with these. You just have to sit down and master them. These discussion questions are pretty darn good. So I really think some of you should go back to chapter 2 and revisit the issues related to classical and operant conditioning. Very relevant for this chapter. And you have to learn how to deal with these figures and the designs. You just have to. So thanks for listening.